Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we continue our study of the second book of Kings, that is Melachim Beis. We are in chapter 4. Today we will complete chapter 4, Perek Daled. We are up to verse 38, that's Pasuk Lamed Ches, and we have just read two incredible miracles performed by Elisha. The first miracle was the miracle of the oil, in which he saved a widow and her two orphans from a terrible fate. The second was the miracle of the resuscitation of a dead child, a child who was born through the blessing of Elisha. And now we're going to read of another miracle, the Elisha Shav HaGilgala. Elisha returned to Gilgal. In other words, after the story that happened above, which occurred in Shunam, he returned to Gilgal. Vihara of Baaretz, and at the time there was a tremendous plague, a suffering in the land, a hunger, a famine. The Gilgal is a place where the prophets, the Bnei HaNeviim, and the students of the prophets, those who were studying to be prophets, this is a group which we've encountered several times before. Yoshvim Lefanav, they were sitting before Elisha. In other words, he went to teach, teach knowledge of God, and so on. And these were these disciples. They were sitting before him. Vayomer Lenaro, and he said to his servant, presumably this would have been Gehazi, Shefos Hasir Hagedola. Set up the big pot, uvashel nozid livnei hanavim, and cook a stew of lentils. And nozid is generally like a stew of beans or lentils for the prophets so they could eat. So there's this terrible hunger, that's going on. The people are hungry, but let's put up a big pot of food for the Bnei Hanavim. Again, we have Elisha preparing food, setting aside food for the members of his group, of his club. Again, we get the sense of Elisha working with those who are close with him, but we're not seeing Elisha out among the people who are also suffering from this terrible famine. So this is a theme that has been going through this entire perek, and it's important to point out. Now, and not to say, of course, that there's anything wrong with feeding his students. Obviously, this is not and meant at all in a critical way of the act that he's doing now, in the same way that his act of helping the woman of Shunam, the wealthy woman from Shunam, and the widow, etc. Of course, those were incredibly wonderful acts. The issue being, though, is that it's deliberately giving you the impression of Elisha performing these acts within his circle, and so on, which we've been pointing out this whole time. So they go ahead. Vayetze echad el asada, and one of the people went out to the field, lilaket orot, to gather roots, to gather vegetables, to put into the stew, to flavor the stew. And presumably because it was a hunger, there was not a lot of greens to choose from. So vayimtza gefen sadeh, he found a vine growing in the field, and he figured, this looks like a good herb. I wonder, let's take it. Vayilaket mimenu pakuot sadeh milo vigdo, and he picked off of this vine. He picked some wild, fruit of some sort that was growing on this vine, enough that he could fit into his garment. In other words, like he wrapped it in his garment in order to hold it and carry it back. Vayavo, and he came back. Vayifalach et el sir hanazid ki lo yadao, and he cut them up and placed them into the pot of nazid, because he didn't know what they were. He didn't know what these fruits that he had cut were. He wasn't familiar with them, but he figured, they didn't have a lot to eat, so he went out on a limb, literally, and decided, let's try these. Maybe they'll make maybe they'll taste good in this pot, and maybe they'll give us some more nutrition. So vayatzku la'anoshim le'achol, and then they served the food to everyone. And when they started eating from this, and the people started to cry, Maves basir ishalim. They cried out to the prophet of God, man of God. There's death in the pot. There's poison. This stuff. It's unclear if it was just like an awful flavor that they were tasting, or maybe they tasted the flavor that was clearly, familiar to them as a poisonous fruit of some sort. Or maybe they started feeling some terrible symptoms from it. And they could not eat it. So this idea that it could not eat it gives you the idea that just the flavor was awful. It was just inedible. It was just terrible. Even under the terrible circumstances that they were in, the flavor was awful. Vayomer ukechu kemach. So he said, go get some flour. Vayashlech el hasir. And he threw flour into the pot. Vayomer tzak la'am v'yochelu. Now give it out to the people, and they can eat it. V'lo haya davara basir. And at that point, there was nothing bad in the pot. It's interesting at this point, it uses a different language. It says tzak la'am, give it out to the people. Presumably, the simple understanding is that it's just give it out to everybody, the people that are here, right? But it's interesting. One might suggest that it chooses a different language. Tzak la'am, give it to all the people. In other words, everyone around, not just the students. Almost as if Elisha was learning the lesson of, in a time of hunger, to feed everyone. But I understand that's not necessarily the simple reading, but it's interesting how it chooses this language of tzak la'am, give it to the people, as opposed to tzak b'nei hanavim, serve it to the prophet disciples. Anyway, it's just a suggestion, an idea. I don't know if I like it or not, but it's an interesting suggestion. So here you have another miracle which was performed by Elisha in order to say, presumably, unless you could figure out some sort of a chemical reason why flour might have mitigated the bad flavor of this thing. It's presented as a miracle by just pouring something as flavorless and as neutral as flour. It neutralized the bad flavor, or whatever poison it was that was in there. It neutralized that, and it made it into a good stew. So now we will continue reading of this chapter. It's one more story, a shorter version, but again another story about another miracle. V'ish mami Baal Shalisha, and a man was coming from a place called Baal Shalisha. Vayavi le'ish Elohim lechem bikurim esrim lechem sorim, and he was bringing to the prophet bread of bikurim. Bikurim generally is understood to mean from the first fruits. We know from the Torah that bikurim, the first fruits, when the first fruits are ripen, they are to be brought to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple, as an offering, and brought and given to the Kohen, to the priests. So one possibility is maybe the prophet was a Kohen, but we don't know that. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So does this actually mean bikurim? It's unclear. But regardless of how we understand this, this is clearly early in the time of harvest. And remember that this is still in the context of a time of famine. And he comes to the prophet with this lechem bikurim, with these loaves of bread, esrim lechem seorim, 20 loaves of barley bread, v'charmel, and some grain, bitziklono, in his sack. And this man brings it to the prophet, presumably for Elisha to, for him and probably also for his students. Vayomer, and he says, Tein la'am v'yochelu, give it to everyone, give it to all the people, and let them eat. Again, it uses this language la'am, and if I was correct in my assumption before, that when it uses this language la'am, meaning to everyone, specifically referring not just to the students that are surrounding me, not just to me, not just those of us that are the members of the disciples, so to speak, but give it to everyone. So this would then represent, the story would represent Elisha changing the mode of operation that he has been until now in this chapter, which was reserving his influence and his help that he's giving to the people, to those that are in his immediate surroundings. But here he specifically says, ten la'am. Don't give it to me, but give it to everyone and let them eat. Now, however, Vayomer Mishar So, his helper, his attendant says, presumably this is Gehazi, right? Who, as we're going to see in the following chapter, is not the most benevolent or not the most generous guy. But he says, "What etain zeh? How can I give this lifnei mea ish before 100 people? Let's look. There's 100 people gathered around here. This is just 20 loaves of bread. How is it gonna? Presumably these are not big loaves. These are rolls or whatever, the equivalent of what we would see today. How is this gonna feed 100 people?" Vayomer, and he said, "Don't worry. Tain la'am, give it to the people v'yochelu." Again, he uses the language la'am, to everyone, and let them eat. Now, I will admit that most understand this la'am refers to the people that are surrounding him. However, I'm suggesting that the choice of this language is to give it to everyone. Because this is what God said: if you eat, there will be, not just will there be enough to eat for everyone, but there will be leftovers afterwards. And surely enough, he put these few loaves in front of everyone, and they ate, and there was leftover, there was more for everyone, for even leftover for others. Kidvar Adonai, as God had spoken. So we see Elisha moving from helping one of his people to helping everyone in this time of famine. And we see another story, another miracle, which is starting slowly to increase the recipients, the beneficiaries of this miracle. And again, as we spoke and 2 podcasts ago, when we did the beginning of this chapter, I mentioned the concept of miracles and how to understand them, how to understand their purpose. But over here, the purpose is to show Elisha growing into his role as someone who is providing for the people in their time of need. This is the conclusion of this chapter. Thank you so much for studying chapter 4 together with me. Looking forward to studying chapter 5 and the rest of this book of Kings together, and have a wonderful day.